Thank you very much, Barbara. General Petraeus has many accolades. Now New York Times best-selling author. I am just a small part of the marketing department for the book, but I say with real heart and conviction, it is an extraordinary book, General Petraeus, because it tells you so much about our modern history that we choose to ignore in terms of understanding war and conflict since 1945, but also it incredibly helpfully gives us a framework for understanding leadership on the battlefield and beyond. And so what I hope we're going to do in this conversation is talk a bit about that concept of strategic leadership and then how it meets the crises, whether in the Middle East, Russia, Ukraine, China, US. And then we'll open up for questions and thoughts. I know people will have views too they want to share with you. Let's start at the beginning if we can. You had a theory learned on the battlefield, or I think grown on the battlefield in Iraq and Afghanistan in particular, about what leadership requires. Do you want to spell that out and we'll take
Sure. So first of all, it's really a pleasure to be here with you all and to see the extraordinary success of an extraordinary firm who's led by an extraordinary strategic leader. And I'll talk about this intellectual construct which I developed between the 3- and 4-star commands in Iraq. When we were back in the US, that's when we did the counterinsurgency field manual and overhauled every aspect of preparation of our forces for deployment to Iraq and Afghanistan. And this construct for strategic leadership, this is leadership at the very top of a military campaign. It's also, frankly, the leadership at the very top of a country. But at a certain point, those big ideas are transferred to the military commander who has to then craft the strategy. So there are 4 tasks of a strategic leader. The truth is all leaders have to perform these 4 tasks. The difference is that the leader at the very top has to get the first one right, or the entire enterprise is building on a shaky intellectual foundation. First, you have to get the big ideas right to craft the right strategy, understand the context in real detail, nuanced strengths and weaknesses of your side, the enemy's side, the geographic terrain, the human terrain, how a country operates, all of this, so that you get those big ideas right. You then have to communicate the big ideas effectively through the breadth and depth of the organization and to everyone who has a stake in the success of the outcome here. Then you have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. This is what we normally think of as leadership. This is the example that the leader provides, the energy, the inspiration, getting great people, developing them, keeping them, allowing those not measuring up to move on to something else. It's how you spend your time, your battle rhythm, we called it, your schedule, your calendar is crucial. Nothing shows what's important more than what you spend your time on. We had a very detailed battle rhythm. I used this intellectual construct explicitly for the surge in Iraq, U.S. Central Command in Afghanistan, the 3 4-star combat commands that I had, and then also at the CIA. So how you spend your time is crucial, and then the metrics have to be the right ones, and they have to be rigorously defined, and the input, the information that is used for those has to be very, very rigorously deconflicted and validated. And then the 4th task, often overlooked, is that you have to formally sit down and determine how you need to refine the big ideas to do it again and again and again. And that 4th task, that should be on your battle rhythm. So for example, once a week, I met with the strategic planners who would force me to make decisions about the campaign, the strategy, because if you want to be somewhere six months from now and you're commanding 200,000 men and women in uniform, you got to decide now. It's a little bit like Santander. If you want to be somewhere a year or 2 from now, Anna's got to make a decision today. So that's the process that we went through, and I find it still a very, very helpful intellectual construct. And I can do this for private sector companies. Take Netflix as an example. I think Reed Hastings, one of the great strategic leaders of our time, right up there with Jack Ma and Jeff Bezos and others. Very, very quickly, Netflix has had at least 4 major ideas, and I've discussed this with Reed, by the way. The first one is that they're going to put movies in the hands of customers without brick and mortar, so they're going to undersell Blockbuster. They do that brilliantly. Blockbuster goes out of business after a couple of years. There's one left in the United States in Big Bend, Oregon. It's become a bit of a tourist attraction for all of us that are nostalgic about renting movies from brick and mortar. But so anyway, they go through that. You know, they sit down here a couple of years later. Well, everybody else is doing this now. So what do we do now? He said, well, you know, broadband speeds are fast enough. We can have people download movies. So that's the new big idea, explains it, oversees it. A couple of years later, what do we do now? Others are doing that too. Well, let's make our own content. $100 million just on House of Cards alone. Incredibly successful. All these other iconic series that we binge watched during the early months of COVID. And then the fourth big idea is we're going to make major motion pictures. And they go out and buy not one, but two major movie studios. And they do that so well, talk about a great metric. They get more Academy Award nominations than any other major motion picture studio in the world about 3 years ago, I think. I did have an issue with one of the movies, and I talked to Reed Hastings about this, which had Brad Pitt playing my very good friend, General Stan McChrystal, who had a sense of humor, unlike the movie. He didn't march around like a little wooden soldier. Besides, I never could get past the fact that Brad Pitt didn't play me. But you get the idea on this. And during the surge in Iraq, the big ideas were 180 degrees different. You know, people talk about change management. It doesn't get any more change than to reverse completely what you've been doing. Instead of pulling out of the neighborhoods and handing off to the Iraqi forces, the level of violence had grown so substantially. Iraq was in a Sunni Shia civil war. We had to go back into the neighborhood, 77 additional locations just in the Baghdad area alone. And we also had to take back control. We also pursued reconciliation. So we didn't just go after the irreconcilables who we identified, and we intensified that effort, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the major Sunni insurgent leaders, the major Iranian-supported Shia leaders. We reconciled with the rank and file, and we told them, if you will stop supporting Al-Qaeda or the Sunni insurgents, if you'll support us instead, life will be better. And it's a crucial distinction because they then came over to our side, and then eventually we got them to support the new Iraq, not just us.
So General, take those four issues,
Yep.
You know, big idea, communication, implementation, refinement, and apply it to the real world situation in the Middle East, Israel, Hamas.
Sure. So I think, you know, it's very clear the big idea at Prime Minister Netanyahu's level is that Hamas and the Islamic Jihad have to be destroyed and the political wing of Hamas has to be dismantled. The conviction is, and I tend to agree with this, that Hamas is like the Islamic State. It's an imperfect analogy. There's a nationalist aspect, Palestinian nationalist aspect to this that isn't captured by this. But again, you cannot reconcile with Hamas. They are a terrorist army in the same way that the Islamic State was when they established the caliphate in northern Iraq and northeastern Syria. And we had to go back in to help the Iraqi security forces to eliminate that and to destroy them, although there are remnants of them, insurgents. And that's why we still have several thousand troops in Iraq and in northeastern Syria. So the military mission, when the Prime Minister says we must destroy Hamas, that means that you have to render the enemy incapable of accomplishing his mission without reconstitution. Keep in mind the without reconstitution, because that's something that will need to be pursued in the post-conflict phase to ensure they cannot reconstitute, as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, by then the Islamic State, was able to do 3.5 years after the end of the surge, after we destroyed Al-Qaeda, and then the Iraqi security forces took their eye off it. So destroying this is the most challenging mission that I can think of, and that my co-author, Andrew Roberts, Lord Roberts of Belgravia, that wonderfully needy part of London, as you all recall. Actually, it is quite needy now because so many of his neighbors actually need a visa to get from Moscow to London since Russia invaded Ukraine. So they haven't seen their beautiful white townhouses in about 20 or 21 months. But again, to translate this, to look at this means you have to go into every building, every floor, every room, every cellar, every tunnel, 300 miles of tunnel, the Gaza Metro. This is the most challenging military mission that I can think of since the end of World War II, which is the period covered in our book. Yes, you can look at Monte Cassino in Italy, or say Stalingrad, or one of these. This is that challenging. This is against an enemy that knows the area well, that has shown a creativity in the offense, however horrific and barbaric that was, and it was, but nonetheless very, very skillful to evade the security measures of the intelligence and the military and so forth. It's an enemy who will blow himself up to take you with him in some cases, which is particularly pernicious because it means you have to keep everyone at arm's length, literally, beyond that. And if a car comes toward you and it doesn't observe, you're going to put a bullet through the window. We had to deal with this at times in Iraq when al-Qaeda was able to recruit suicide bombers and pump them into Iraq at about 110 per month until we drove that down to below 5 during the surge. So a very, very challenging, it's going to be a very destructive mission, and there's going to be a lot of innocent civilian life. But so the big idea, as announced, is to destroy Hamas and dismantle the political wing. That means you're going to have to take it over as well. And what I would welcome, and I think would
take it over being take Gaza.
Take over Gaza. I see no alternative. Again, you can say you don't want to. You can say that you want a competent, capable Palestinian entity to come in there and take it over, but they don't want to ride in on the backs of Israeli tanks. And I'm not sure you can have an entity right now that would be trustworthy, because you've got to not only restore basic services, hand out humanitarian assistance, begin reconstruction of the damaged infrastructure, you also have to have a counterinsurgency campaign to ensure that the remnants of Hamas and the Islamic Jihad cannot reconstitute with Iran's aid. Iran is going to be out there trying to help this. So again, I think it would be very advisable to hear the plan for the post-conflict phase. I think is very, very important. By the way, we learned this the hard way. The post-conflict phase planning for Iraq, I was only a 2-star then, but I remember asking in Kuwait, I said, could you give us a little more detail on what happens after we get to Baghdad and topple the regime? And they said, you just get us to Baghdad, Dave, we'll take it from there. That was inadequate, and it proved to be. And then we compounded that with 2 horrifically bad big ideas, which was to fire the Iraqi army without telling them how we're going to enable them to provide for their families. So you create hundreds of thousands of people who are against the new Iraq rather than supporting it. And then we compounded that by firing the Ba'ath Party down to the level of bureaucrats, tens of thousands we actually needed to help run the country. We didn't know enough about it, and we could have used them. I actually got authority to do that. I was the commander of the 101st Airborne Division in Mosul by then, and we actually were able to reconcile with those, but no one else was able to do that. So again, a huge, you've got to think about the day after, the post-conflict phase, and they should be announcing that now. They should be announcing now, I think, that life for the Palestinians in Gaza will be much, much better when this terrorist army that has been running this area is gone. And they should explain how they're going to do that. That's, again, what we did for the Sunni Arabs. We said life will be much, much better if we get rid of al-Qaeda and if you help us do it. And also the Sunni insurgent groups. We did the same for the Shia militia supported by Iran relative. We've reconciled with 103,000 Iraqis formally. We did this. There should be, again, an announcement of what that will be and an acknowledgement that Israel, I think, inevitably is going to have to run Gaza for the near term. Look, I'd love to see Gulf states and others step up and say, we'll take this over. But no one really wants to take this on. This is going to be a very, very challenging mission.
But General Petraeus, so let me take you to the sort of 4th element then of your sort of model for strategic leadership. Because I think if I was sitting in that weekly refine the thinking meeting, I'd play back to you and say, you're saying that the big idea here is to destroy Hamas at the risk of a military operation that is equivalent to Stalingrad.
Yeah, that may be a bit misplaced. I mean, it's going to be very, very damaging, and inevitably, again, we did major cities in Iraq, Ramadi, Fallujah. We got it right in Fallujah finally in 2007. Mosul, nearly the size of bigger than Gaza City, not as problematic. No, this is going to be there will be, it already has been, loss of innocent civilian life and damage and destruction. That is inevitable. And I think the more that you can explain that you are seeking to minimize that loss, minimize that damage, that you are abiding by the laws of land warfare, purity of arms is how the Israelis conceive of it. It's the same as the Geneva Convention. And that life is going to be better because this is what you're going to do in the wake of this. And by the way, you start showing that. As you clear an area that's large enough, by the way, you have to hold these areas. You don't just go from building to building. You clear a building and you have to leave substantial forces behind or the enemy will re-infiltrate behind you.
But
so it's very progressive and methodical.
But what I'm trying to ask you, General, is when you read the book, what's really clear is that leadership that gets the big idea wrong always loses, right? And when I hear you, I've got to confess to being quite frightened by what you're describing. Frightened in terms of the loss of life, and frightened in terms of the prospect of occupying or running Gaza and then finding some way of handing over.
There are nothing but bad ideas here, or bad options, if you will.
Okay.
Not bad ideas, it's bad options.
But what's the other option?
There is no other option. The other option is you let them reconstitute and come at you again, even more horrifically.
There's no other option.
Keep in mind the context here. 1,400 Israelis killed on 10/7. If you put that in U.S. terms, remember we lost not quite 3,000 in the 9/11 attacks. This would be over 50,000 Americans killed, again, per capita terms. The over 200 hostages are over 7,000 probably. It's even more than 200 now. So again, if you put that in, if you understand that, and I think you have to, then you understand the fiendishly difficult position that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his military leaders are in.
But I suppose what I'm trying to also get at is if you put the number of Palestinian deaths as a percentage of the Palestinian population, it would also have, I can't do the maths on the hoof, but the numbers would be
no question
huge.
about it. No question. Although you need to take these numbers.
I do. I'm not trying to get into
grain of salt. And I mean, think of the hospital bombing that supposedly killed 500. It turned out to be some dozens, and then it turned out that it was a result of an Islamic Jihad rocket that didn't make it all the way to Israel, not an Israeli bomb. And they can show you that on the tracks of the counterfire radar, as they ultimately did. But unfortunately, that report was immediately embraced by an awful lot of, including, as I recall, it took the New York Times a few days to acknowledge that perhaps it was incorrect.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is, for those of us who are not schooled in conflict and don't understand military options, if they called you in, if Netanyahu and Benny Gantz and others called you in and said, can you give us some options here on how we prosecute a military response to the murderous attacks of the 7th of October, are there others than the ones that we're seeing playing out?
The way they're carrying it out, you can certainly discuss that. And as I mentioned, the fact that there should be at least 2 additional huge ideas.
Yeah.
Life's going to be better. Here's how we're going to ensure that it is, and we will have to administer it, although we don't want to. And even though the President of the United States has cautioned them against it, rightly, I get that. But I see no alternative to that. Again, I'm looking around the region to see who's raising their hand and say, hey, we are concerned about the Palestinians. We will take that over. But keep in mind, the Israelis have to have confidence in who takes this over, that it's not going to be, once again, what Hamas has been doing. I mean, you don't build 300 miles of tunnels without diverting massive quantities of what is supposed to be used for constructing homes and schools and infrastructure. I mean, this is cement with rebar in it, concrete. These are very sophisticated. Some of them actually have rails on the bottom and so forth. So again, as I said, there's nothing but bad options here. And that's the challenge for them. And the criticism is going to grow. The half-life of sympathy is already eroding in a number of places around the world.
One of the things that I have to say is that is shocking about reading conflict, as I said, when I read it, I just thought to myself, there's so much of our modern recent history that we look away from. It's just how many wars, how many people have died in war, how many different national security risks there are. And of course, we're talking about the situation in the Middle East, the situation in Ukraine. It's hard for us to believe that there's a war going on in Ukraine, and yet.
Well, welcome to reality again. And again, this underscores also the imperative of deterrence. People are all concerned that while we're spending 2% of GDP on defense, yeah, you know how much you have to spend if you have a conflict?
Yeah.
Just look at Ukraine. But by the way, for what it's worth, the European countries in aggregate now, we believe, a team that I look at this stuff, believe that Europe has now pledged more security assistance than the $44 billion that the U.S. has pledged, which is great to see. Obviously, it's a lot closer to Europe. But for those in the U.S. for years who rightly have said, why are we spending X percent of GDP and it's actually closer to you? So again, this is heartening to see, particularly Germany, which wasn't even at 1.5% of GDP on defense, now has pledged at least that it's going to hit the 2% mark, which is what NATO countries agreed at the Wales summit.
So can I put to you that the West, this is not a popular view, but the West has got the big idea wrong on Ukraine, in that it overestimates the risk of Russian retaliation and is providing insufficient support to Ukraine to win?
I'm not sure I'd share that, actually. I mean, I'd like to see more. I think that the U.S. has led this very impressively. And by the way, I'm completely non-political. I don't even register to vote. So I talk to members of either party seek my views. I think that some of the decisions have been slower than they needed to be. The decisions on tanks, on F-16s, on longer range Army tactical missile system, ATACMS as it's termed, and a variety of others. But again, $44 billion of assistance is a staggering quantity. And yes, we need to get an authorization and appropriation for more, and I think we will. But by and large, I think that the response has been very, very impressive. I disagree with the decision of this administration to withdraw from Afghanistan. I thought there were options that were sustainable there. They were not ideal. Again, it was a frustrating, maddening situation. But I also felt that we would regret that decision. And I hope we have, because the outcome, I think, has been not just tragic. I think it has been disastrous for the people of a country, 37 million of whom we were trying to help for better part of 20 years.
But can I ask, the reason I ask you about the risk of retaliation is one of the points...
Yeah, I don't share that, actually. I think that Russia will rattle the nuclear saber, and they will not use it. Again, keep in mind that it's not just the U.S. and European leaders who have cautioned Vladimir Putin against this. It's President Xi and Prime Minister Modi, and they have done that publicly, both of them. I also think that he will be in a much deeper hole. What's that old saying, if you're in a hole, stop digging? He'll be in a much deeper hole if he were ever to use tactical nuclear weapons. And I don't know how you use them to any effect anyway. Ukraine's not going to stop fighting. The world will be even more outraged. So again, what we need to be doing is everything we possibly can to enable the Ukrainians to convince Putin that this war is unsustainable in the same way that Afghanistan became unsustainable, noting that they've taken many, many times the casualties in the first 20, 21 months of this war that they took in nearly 10 years in Afghanistan. But Putin himself still thinks that the Russians can outsuffer the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Americans, and we need to convince them otherwise.
I probably have too childish a view of what it is to be the director of the CIA, that somehow you have access to this huge wealth of information that you can't possibly tell us. But
I can't talk about Area 51 in particular.
Thank you very much. But General, what happens when the rumors go around that Vladimir Putin is not well? You hear these stories.
The director of the CIA publicly has said that unfortunately Putin is all too well.
Right. But do you have
publicly said that.
But do you have confidence in that information?
Yeah.
Right.
I know Bill Burns well.
Okay, fine. No. I'm not commenting on the. I'm not commenting on the.
I wish it
director of
were
the
otherwise.
CIA.
I I know everybody watches his hand grip the table and all this stuff, but no, sadly.
Okay.
All too robust.
Let's deal with perhaps the
He's
biggest...
the same age I am, by the way. I seem to be able to still, the elevator goes to the top floor on most days.
Glad to hear it. In your case, I'm glad to hear it. Or let's just sort of finish just on the Ukraine-Russia story then. What's your outlook for how this resolves, if it resolves?
Well, it depends, and I think it's I taught economics in an earlier academic life, and you always answer every question by saying, it depends, and it does. It depends on a number of different factors: continued U.S. and Western support, continued ability of Ukraine to generate additional forces, keeping in mind that their population is less than 1/3 the size of Russia's, but Russia is not fully mobilized, and their economy is even less relative terms. Whether Russian forces might crack and crumble. I mean, the Ukrainians know what they're fighting for. This is their war of independence. They're fighting for their very survival. I was just there again 4 weeks ago. I was there 4 months ago as well. And yes, the mood is more sober, given the counteroffensive has not achieved all that we'd hoped it would, without question. No plan survives contact with the enemy, and theirs did not. The minefields are much deeper than anybody imagined, much deeper than Russian doctrine calls for them. And then the density of the mines is double that imagined as well. But they have ground out gains, 150 meters instead of 5 kilometers. But do the Russian forces, they look around, the Ukrainians can look over their shoulder and again see who they're fighting for. The Russians look around and they see Ukrainians in occupied territory that hate them. Will they crack? Might they crumble? Might, again, Russians be unable to generate? They've lost at least 50%, maybe 60% of their tank fleet. So again, when do they start to have challenges generating? I mean, there's a reason they're sending prisoners and convicts and all the rest of this to the front lines. So all these different factors, I think, are what, and then ultimately it depends on the man in the Kremlin. Is he willing to acknowledge that this has not gone well and that he needs to get out? This is why we have to continue to tighten the financial, economic, and personal sanctions and export controls, and also tighten the efforts to go after those that are evading those sanctions. But again, you can't, it's going to be longer, clearly. There's not going to be, it doesn't appear that there's going to be a kind of breakthrough that could change the dynamics dramatically, although the Ukrainians have done much more damage to Russian facilities on Crimea than people recognize. I mean, their use of maritime drones has been so impressive that they've actually forced the Russians to withdraw the bulk of their Black Sea fleet from the port of Sevastopol. And they hit the Black Sea Fleet headquarters during their command and staff meeting. That's pretty extraordinary. And they've been doing a lot of damage to the lines of communication in the airfields as well. But again, it depends on those factors. And I think for right now, you're going to see the Ukrainians fight through the winter. They're going to try to achieve this breakthrough, try to get the Russian forces to crumble, but it's an uncertain affair.
General, let's deal with the, if you like, the contest that's hovered over things for the last decade or two now, which is China and the US.
Sure. Yep.
And I suspect everyone in this room will have their own view of how they see China as
Sure.
an economic competitor. Most of us have no way of understanding China as a military competitor. How would you describe it?
Oh, I mean, they've invested enormously in their military. They've developed very considerable additional capabilities. They're investing huge in the nuclear force, building aircraft carriers, surface combatants, all the rest of this, without question. They're only spending still about 1/3 of what we spend, but their labor costs, to put it mildly, are a lot lower, shall we say, and so on. Look, I'm sure with everyone in here, we'd like to see this relationship between China and the West be as mutually beneficial as is possible. Look, I'm a partner in one of the world's biggest investment firms, we've raised the biggest funds in Asia. But the challenges continue to grow. And I'm not just now talking militarily, I'm talking about just the economic competition. Our National Security Advisor says that we're in severe competition. What we have to do is make sure it doesn't become severe conflict, because the damage, destruction, cost of that would be horrific. The way you do that, by the way, is ensure that the elements of deterrence are solid, that the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand and your willingness to use them is not wanting. We do have to transform our capabilities from what might simplistically be described as a small number of large platforms, surface combatants and so forth, that are incredibly capable but also incredibly expensive and increasingly vulnerable, to a massive number of smaller systems, most of which will be unmanned, not just remotely piloted, but increasingly, and yes, this is a little bit scary, but increasingly algorithmically piloted, to where the human in the loop is the human that designs the software and that captures the conditions that the machine has to meet based on its use of, again, artificial intelligence, machine learning, et cetera, before it can take a kinetic or non-kinetic action. And all this stitched together with incredible communications. And we're talking not just in the air, we're talking on the surface of the sea, under the sea, on ground, in outer space, and the equivalent in cyberspace, which is already there by and large.
Let's just take a quick diversion into this question of AI and the future of warfare, because Anna was talking this morning about how transformative AI and LLMs will be. All of us, I think, are beginning to understand the potential of these things, but how difficult it is to identify how they make decisions. And in warfare, that seems to me to be particularly frightening.
Well, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, again, as a commander, we would establish conditions for taking certain actions. The machine can meet those conditions, actually can do better than a human eyeball can. It can use voice recognition, face recognition, you can gait recognition. There's all the different ways that you can, and then it can validate whatever other conditions. If you say there can be no civilians in the radius of the effects of your bomb or your Hellfire missile or what have you, the machine can do that and probably do it better than a human can, and it can certainly make that final decision more rapidly. If you have a human in the loop still, your machine's going to lose to the other machine. This is scary, I know. It is very, very ethically challenging, but that's where warfare is headed. Let me also just talk very briefly, though, about what I think is the biggest of the big ideas for the world. First of all, it is that I believe the U.S. uniquely, together with our allies and partners around the world, has to keep more plates spinning. If you use the analogy of the guy in the tent that gets plates spinning, keeps them all spinning, than at any time since the end of World War II. And the challenges that those plates represent are more complex than they have been. So there's a China plate that's bigger than all the others together. For that, we need a comprehensive, integrated whole of governments with an S on the end policy to China, all working together in as much harmony as you can. I recognize, and by the way, I think we've done reasonably well in that regard. And with one exception, that is from the U.S. perspective, the lack of a trade component. We should have gone with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but did not. But then there's all these other plates. You still have to deter North Korea. You have to deal with Russia, obviously. There's Iran, maybe it's several plates. There's a nuclear plate. There's a support to Shia militia plate. There's a missile and rocket plate. There are Islamist extremist groups out there still. We learned the hard way. You have to keep an eye on them. You have to keep those plates and pressure on them. There are various challenges that result from climate change. You know, the desertification, the migration problems that Spain and so many other countries have had to deal with in Europe. Again, the list goes on. There's cyber threats, some discrete cyber threats, North Korea, Iran, Russia, and others, but also criminal actors. So again, the challenges out there are enormous. And we've got to have a joined up, comprehensive, integrated, and again, whole of governments with an S on the end, noting there will be differences of opinion, there will be that kind of thing, but you have to get the overarching approach right. And that's certainly true when it comes to China, first and foremost, noting that the challenges for investing in China and taking Chinese investment have been growing this is the bulk, so I chair the KKR Global Institute, which does the geopolitical risk, and over the 10 years that I've been there, geopolitical risk has become far, far more important a consideration during diligence. You know, we were in a world of benign globalization in which barriers to trade, investment, capital flows were going down and global trade was going like this, to now an era of renewed great power rivalries in which those barriers are going up and global trade is almost flat. Actually, and globalization has become regionalization and slowbalization. So again, all of these challenges are out there. There's great job security if you do geopolitics these days.
Well, just on that, one of the things that rattled me, one of the other things that rattled me in the book was you do a kind of quick history of amphibious assaults. Always seem to be quite risky, getting soldiers.
Very risky. Yeah, that and urban operations, I think, among the most challenging.
And one of the things that's interesting is you then list how successful so many of them have been, and end up making the point that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, that often looks like it's logistically very difficult to pull off, may be difficult but doable.
I mean, the magnitude of difficulty is enormous, and a lot depends on indicators and warnings. I mean, you can't mass a fleet like that without someone noticing. So again, hugely difficult.
So do you think we overestimate?
We get a vote. I don't think we're overestimating. But we get a vote. We have agency here. If our deterrence is solid, again, what we want is for every day in Beijing, the leadership wakes up and it says, "Okay, not today." Until we can get to a point where we can get back to this more mutually beneficial relationship where we recognize that we can all do better together if we get along than if we have differences. But we probably need to start going.
I want to get some questions.
So questions.
As we sort of bring the lights up and get the mics, I'm just going to ask you one other thing, General, which is, what is there that other people worry about that you don't worry about? What is there that you feel? Ed Gear asked me this question last night. What are you optimistic about?
Innovation in the United States. There is an ecosystem in the U.S. that is just extraordinary. It has to do with the rewards that you can reap. There's a number of different factors, the great universities, the research universities that we have, the culture of entrepreneurship, of the American dream, all these different aspects, I think. So I'm also a personal venture capitalist. My wife and I have invested in 27 startups, multiple rounds in many cases, and I just find them unbelievably exciting, as I do the KKR big investments, to be sure. But that's what I'm optimistic about.
Hopefully there's some people with mics. There's a lady here.
There's a woman right there that's raising her hand. Yep. You could shout it out if you. We'll hear you.
Do shout and I'll relay.
Use your military command voice.
Do you think it sits within all of us?
It's deep down. What was it last night?
Breathe.
Yes, breathe. Great question. The question is, what happens with Hezbollah? Keep in mind that Iran doesn't just support Hamas and the Islamic Jihad. It has built this massive militia in southern Lebanon called Hezbollah. It's also supportive of Shia militia that have been shooting rockets and sending drones at our forces in Iraq and Syria, and we struck some of their bases. Hezbollah poses a particularly difficult threat because it has approximately 150,000 rockets and missiles aimed at Israel. And the missiles in particular now are more accurate and larger warheads. But Israel pounded Hezbollah so much in 2006, we didn't realize initially. I was in Iraq, I guess, at that time, and the assessment was that the Israeli Air Force had overpromised and underdelivered. We reassessed that. By the time I was the commander of the Greater Middle East, U.S. Central Command, and then later as CI director, we reassessed how much damage was done, and it was enormous. They're still rebuilding in some cases. And so the assessment is that Hezbollah will continue to launch rockets and perhaps some missiles or so forth, but that Israel can deal with those, especially now that it's called up all its reserves. U.S. is sending our additional Iron Dome batteries and the interceptors, that they can deal with that. Because if Hezbollah really brings tens of thousands of rockets onto Israel, that it's going to get hammered just like it did back in 2006. So again, touch wood though, because that's a very uncertain assessment. But I can assure you that Israel is very, very much focused on that. It's ready for that if it happens. And it will be very, very tough for Hezbollah if they do that. It's going to set them back again. I think you've seen that Hassan Nasrallah and others have actually implied in public statements that they're not that keen. They have huge sympathy for the Palestinians, and the Iranians might like them to do more to Israel because Iran doesn't do it directly. They want to avoid a direct war with the US or even with Israel. They use their proxies. But by and large, we think that that is unlikely. We've seen the Houthis, by the way, also launch some cruise missiles at Israel, which the US intercepted. But what you really are painting a picture of, which I think is very important, is the possibility of regionalization of this war, and that is worrisome. Also, I should say the West Bank, the situation there is very troubling. And again, this is why I think it's very important that Israel provides a vision for the future in Gaza for Palestinians. I believe they should be doing it for the Palestinians in the West Bank as well, that you have to give a future. If it's continuation of what you have, then there's going to be continued unrest.
Sir.
On Spain, a grand, wonderful, hospitable, actually a great country. Obviously, Europe. I don't do domestic politics in the U.S., much less in other countries, but we watch them very carefully. What can I say? But it doesn't keep us from investing. And so, again, I think the investment climate's terrific. We own a lot of real estate here and a variety of other things. It should indicate our confidence, I think towers and a variety of other assets.
Yes, there's a lady from the front here.
The way to think, so how do you deal with organized crime? Yep, and
so you're saying particularly in Latin America?
Organized crime. Well, I mean, in Mexico, again, Mexico has all of these advantages. They're inside the biggest economic unit in the world. There's friendshoring taking place from China and from elsewhere. There's nearshoring. They have lower labor costs. The U.S. economy remains really very, very vibrant. You saw the growth figures for the most recent period are staggering, actually. And so they should be benefiting even more than they are, were it not for the populism in their leadership, which is reversing the very impressive reforms that were carried out by the Peña Nieto administration, particularly in energy, but also some other areas. And then, frankly, the problems with the erosion of the rule of law, where you have essentially criminal empires. So, how do you deal with it? You think of it as a counterinsurgency campaign, but the insurgents are not the typical, they're not Islamist extremists, obviously. They're not ideological, they're not communists or something. They are criminals. The problem is the magnitude of the challenge is so significant that a president in Mexico, especially if they've changed parties, takes a year or so to realize how serious it is, and then only has 4 more years because you can't run for re-election. It's a single 6-year term. I've dealt with this as the director of the CIA, then as I originated the first deal in Mexico. We've done a number of investments there, but it's a very tricky, very rocky landscape in certain respects. And that's really unfortunate for the Mexican people because they have so much else going on, good demographics, good workforce, in growing middle class, all the rest of this. But that aspect, plus the nationalization, if you will, of certain industries and so forth, are impediments to it. So again, you have to conceive of this as you have to clear, hold, build. It's what they did in Monterrey 15 years ago. As you know, the group of 10 or whatever, now it's a group of 12. I just met with them again. They essentially reformed the entire police force, the rule of law, other elements of the rule of law, and that has been a huge advantage for Monterrey. It has made them the manufacturing colossus of Latin America, but even that is eroding a bit now, and they're looking at what it is they can do to shore that back up. but it's a very, very pernicious problem. And then if you talk about the Central American countries, very, very challenging there as well. Again, at the heart of that, often there's some aspect of illegal narcotics. There's an aspect of, again, corruption, lack of rule of law, and so forth.
General, we've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm just going to take a couple of questions at the same time. It's a gentleman here and a lady there, and then one gentleman. We're going to do three in a row, and then ask you to answer. Sir.
I am Thomas Abadia. Thank you very much, Mr. Petraeus, for your very interesting comments. We are living in a very deep geopolitical moment in which Russia has a tremendous ambition. May I ask you, what are your views on the reaction of Europe and USA and the transatlantic relationship on the specific issue of the invasion of Crimea, the invasion of Crimea, the peninsula of Crimea in Ukraine, the withdrawal of Afghanistan? Don't you think that we have more space of improving our behavior between the United States, the European Union, and the NATO? Thank you very much for your comments.
I agree with you. Actually, let me just do them one at a time. I'll forget the first one by the time we get to the last one. No, I agree with you very much. I think that the red line that was not a red line in Syria, the tepid response to the occupation of Crimea and the fighting in Donbass, the tepid response to the Russian actions in Georgia, in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, the tepid response to some of the actions in the South China Sea and in cyberspace, all of these, then you add in the lack of strategic patience in Afghanistan, the inability, all we had was 3,500 troops. We hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months. We could have easily sustained that. All of these send a message that was not sufficient to deter Putin from taking the horrific action that he has taken in Ukraine, noting, though, that he's lost the Battle of Kyiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, Kharkiv Oblast, and Kherson, but now it's been somewhat static again, albeit with some gains in the south, around Robotna and also in Bakhmut. So this is why, again, it's so crucial that you invest in deterrence and take actions that don't undermine it. Yes.
Lady in the front. There's a mic just there. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Since we are talking about geopolitics, many would say that Putin's full invasion of Ukraine marked the beginning of the geopolitical European Union. Now, given how divided European countries are on the whole Israel-Hamas conflict, would you say this is the war that ends the dream of a geopolitical European Union?
No, I wouldn't, actually, with respect. I'm one who believes that what Europe and the EU have done is hugely important. I would contend that Vladimir Putin has been the greatest gift to NATO since the end of the Cold War. I mean, think about it. Putin set out to make Russia great again. What he's actually done is make NATO great again, forcing two historically neutral countries to join NATO. So yeah, there are differences, and we'll see these, obviously, on Israel, especially given the optics, given the photos, the images, and damage that is inevitable in this campaign. But I don't think that that's going to undermine, I'd be actually more worried about the populism in a couple of the Eastern European countries than I am about that.
So thank you. One final question here. Sir.
Thank you. Quick one regarding the timeline of the Gaza situation and Hamas. Conflicts tend to carry much longer than perhaps we expect initially. Do you expect the situation with Hamas to be resolved in the shorter term, or do you think this is, again, another conflict that may carry longer than we expect?
I fear it may carry on longer. Again, I've actually done as a 2-star and then 4-star some major urban battles. This one is more difficult than any of those. I think it's more difficult than anything since the end of World War II. Hue City in Vietnam, maybe an exception. I mean, there have been a couple of these, but this is going to be fiendishly difficult. And I think it will take time because you have to do it very methodically, very progressively. And if you don't, you'll have the enemy in behind you and all the rest of that.
So do you mean time like months?
Oh, I think
years?
at least months. And beyond that, again, it depends. And I could list the factors on which it will depend. But very clearly, this is not going to be a short endeavor.
Thank you.
I know there are many other questions. We've gone over time, I think, for the obvious reason that it was just so interesting and important to get
Well,
to
thank
you.
you.
General
Thanks for
Petraeus.
guiding it. Thank you
Ladies
all
and
very
gentlemen,
much.
General Petraeus.
Thank you.